Welcome to the Menopause Conversations podcast. My name's Angela Council and I'm your host for this podcast, and this is where you learn all about menopause, what is happening to your body, to your hormones, and life in general. Everything is changing and sometimes it can seem really confusing, but this is where the confusion stops right now. This podcast will share with you everything you need to know about how you can navigate your menopause transition with ease. So sit back and enjoy the show. Bye for now.
Hello and welcome back to this week's episode of the Menopause Conversations podcast. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about how menopause impacts your brain. Now, you're not going crazy, and there are definitely changes that are happening to your brain as you come through this time of life. Now, I know many women are really concerned about developing Alzheimer's, dementia, mainly because they've had a parent that's been through this as well. And we do know that there is a genetic component to it. But it doesn't. You don't have to, just because one of your parents or grandparents went through that, doesn't mean this needs to be your story as well. So let's start with what is Alzheimer's and why does there seem to be a little bit of an increase of Alzheimer's in the current day. So Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia, and it's a physical brain condition. So it actually changes the way the brain works, and it results in impaired memories, thinking and behavior, and their ability to be able to think clearly and recognize others deteriorates over time. And we all know or have seen people who are in this stage of life, and it's really sad in some ways that they're not recognizing their closest family, those who who in the past have meant the most to them. But then again, on the other side of things, sometimes we see people with Alzheimer's and dementias who seem to revert to a childlike state and don't always, now obviously everyone is different, but don't always get upset about the fact that they don't understand who these people are around them. Everyone's experience is different, but I know that it can be very scary for children or family who are supporting a parent through this. And many women who I work with are very concerned because they have seen their mother go through this. Now, is there an increase in Alzheimer's? Well, one would say, well, maybe it's because we've been doing more study on it, which means it's now being diagnosed more. But our lifestyle and our diets are also playing a really large role in this. And there's been with the research that is being done, we're actually seeing the link between particularly our diet and the way the brain functions and what happens. In fact, Alzheimer's commonly is known as type 3 diabetes, which means we know that diet plays a role. We know that insulin is playing a role, blood glucose is playing a role, because our brain gets energy from the glucose that we have in our body. But there's a dysfunctioning that is happening between the brain and the pancreas and this the insulin and the blood levels. So it's not a simple answer what causes Alzheimer's. It is multifactorial, and there's also a genetic component as well. Now, we do know that in most modern or Western societies, US, Europe, and likely Australia and New Zealand as well, that 2/3 of the people who experience Alzheimer's are actually women. And the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare in 2022 listed dementia as the second leading cause of death in Australia and the leading cause of death in women. Now, this is really significant because probably up until that time, 2022, heart disease was the leading cause of death in women. So there's been a shift from, whilst heart disease does also impact many women, it can also be very much a silent disease. Many women just have their first heart attack and they die from that. It now appears that Alzheimer's is taking over And once again, it could be because we're doing more diagnosis and more research, but that something is shifting. And I know that there's been a lot of research around the link between estrogen and Alzheimer's, but women's estrogen levels have always dropped. So it can't be that change in estrogen or menopause that can actually be the trigger for this increase in the death from Alzheimer's disease. There's something else going on. And, the thing that really jumps up at is like the food that we're eating, the lifestyle choices, the stress we're under, the environmental toxins, all impact the brain. So are men and women's brains different? Well, the answer to that question is yes, they are. Women's brains effectively run largely on estrogen during our reproductive stage of life, and men's brains basically run more on testosterone. So as women come through the menopause transition, their estrogen levels come down, but men's testosterone levels come down as well. So it's happening, this change in hormones is happening both in men and women. But our brains are still different. And probably the biggest difference between men and women is that women's transition through the perimenopause and menopause stage probably happens in a shorter time frame. Look, typically between the ages of 45 and 55, so it's about a 10-year transition. For men, though, the decline in testosterone can start a lot earlier, and it is a lot slower and continues into old age. So it's probably the speed at which these hormones are shifting, which is the biggest difference in how men and women's brains work. And because women are having a more significant shift in hormone than men are, that's where it appears that the higher risk comes from men. But there's probably other things that are happening as well. So as I said before, this drop in estrogen does impact our brain and increase our risk. And the reason for this is because estrogen is very protective, and specifically it's neuroprotective. So it does support the brain function, and it helps to regulate glucose metabolism with the brain. It also helps the brain to grow and keep the neurons working properly, and it reduces inflammation. So estrogen does play a big role in the protection of the brain and also the heart and other organs within the body. So as we lose our estrogen, what happens is we lose the protection. So in essence, what has to happen is now that because we're not getting that hormone protection, it now becomes our responsibility to start taking control of what's happening. So, it's up to us to make sure that, we're regulating our own glucose metabolism based on, the food that we're eating. It's important that we reduce inflammation, once again, based on food and stress and toxins. So we now have to take a bit more responsibility, whereas before estrogen was actually doing some of that job for us. But it's important to know that the brain does adapt. So whilst we're in our reproductive stage of life, the brain speaks a lot to the ovaries. So there's a lot of communication going backwards and forwards to the ovaries and the estrogen. Increased estrogen comes up at certain times of the month and then it drops down. And that's all controlled with a communication channel between the brain and the ovaries. But as the ovaries start to shut down because it no longer has a supply of eggs, the brain actually now has to rewire itself. And then it shifts its communications from primarily being with the ovaries, and it actually now moves the communications over to the adrenal glands. And this shift, this rewiring that happens can take 5, 6, 7 years. So it can take a few years to happen. And one of the biggest issues is that many women are adrenally worn out. So they're highly, highly stressed by the time they get, to their mid-40s, into their mid-50s as they're coming through this menopause transition. So they're losing hormones. They're highly stressed because they're managing jobs, families, parents, all of that. The adrenal glands, which is designed to create stress hormones, which are designed to keep you alive. The adrenal glands can also produce some reproductive hormones as well. So, but if they're all putting all their resources into producing the stress hormones, there's not enough left over for the reproductive hormones. So this is now when the communication between the brain, there's not a clear communication going on. And as I said, this can take a few years to actually do this change. But we do know that once this rewiring happens, and the brain now starts to communicate with the adrenal glands as opposed to the ovaries, then a lot of the symptoms start to settle down. And this is postmenopausal. So postmenopausal, a couple of years postmenopausal, generally for the majority of women, symptoms will settle down. The brain will get a bit clearer. You'll be able to think clearer because this rewiring has actually changed. Now, it is important to know that, hot flushes and a few of these other symptoms are actually starting in the brain. We always used to think they started in the ovaries, but it's not. It's actually started in the brain. The brain is what a trigger for a hot flush. And quite often that trigger comes from a stress trigger. So the adrenal glands kind of send a message straight up to the brain and that there's some stress going on because it releases some cortisol, and then the brain reacts. And with the brain, within the brain, there's a hypothalamus, and it kind of regulates our temperature. And when we're younger, there's a wider range of temperature variability, which means that, if you get hot, the body will cool itself down. If you're cold, it will warm itself up. So there's kind of this wider range. But as we get older, that range becomes smaller. So the hypothalamus can't adjust our temperature quite as much. It can't adjust the thermostat. So we kind of get a message from the adrenal glands to the brain that there's something going on. So the brain reacts and it actually raises the temperature. Whereas when we were younger, that would have happened when we were younger, but it would have dropped it back pretty quickly. But because now we're in this different variability, what happens is we get hotter and hotter and the body isn't cooling itself down. And it's because the brain is basically flipped a switch that says we need to heat up. And it's been driven by the communication that says there's some danger, I've got some stress, or alcohol will trigger that. Certain foods will trigger that. So the brain gets triggered and it heats the body up. And then it will come back down, and sometimes it cools the body too much. So that's where we go from a hot flush to a cold chill, and that can happen as well. And this is just because of these communication, this rewiring is still not completely developed. But then once we've got the brain rewired, then hot flushes will generally sort themselves out and they stop. Now, if they don't stop, it means that there's something else that's going on. And quite often it's stress, and there's a lot of lifestyle things that are going on as well. So this kind of conversation between the brain and our glands is known as the neuroendocrine system. So endocrine system is a gland that produces hormone, and neuro is the brain. So we have this communication that goes on all of the time. Now, there is more research that's now being done, particularly on women's brains as they come through this menopause transition. So Dr. Lisa Mosconi, she's a researcher, and she's also the author of a newly released book called The Menopause Brain, and she also did another one called The XX Brain, so the female brain. And she's been doing research and studying brain images using MRI and PET scans, and actually seeing a change in the brain structure in the grey and white matter volume. Also, she's able to see the change in glucose metabolism. So this is what controls, the blood glucose and insulin within our body, and also seeing how the blood flow is also changing through the brain as we're coming through this time of life as well. So they can actually see these changes, but what they're also seeing is that these changes are temporary, and that generally they will either stabilize or reverse post-menopause. So it's not as if your brain is not working, and I know sometimes it feels like it is it's just like absolutely crazy. I can't work. I can't think. And yes, the brain is changing, but generally a lot of this is due to the fact that we just have so much going on. We're trying to juggle so many different, plates, balls, whatever. We've got so much going on that there's a little bit of overwhelm because the brain just can't take everything we're trying to do. And because it is trying to rewire itself and we're just trying to push a whole pile of stuff on top of it. So, it's not just because our estrogen levels are dropping, it's because we're trying to get the brain to do too much in such a short amount of time. And, there are things that we can do, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the question comes up is, well, don't we just take hormones? And if we just take hormones, we'll get the estrogen level back up and then the brain will be protected. Well, there's no definitive research that says that that will happen. We do know that as estrogen levels come down, that the brain loses some protection that the estrogen gave it. But we don't know that putting estrogen back in actually puts that protection back in, because the brain has already started to rewire itself. And I know there's a lot of conversation saying, well, we should be taking hormones because that will protect our brain as we age. There is no research that actually says that it will happen. There's a lot of supposition that that might happen, but no one's been able to show that that does happen. So, will it help? We don't know, because the research is not old enough. To be able to work that out is going to take many years. It's probably going to take 20 years to actually see if that happens. And we don't know now because we haven't been doing this research for long enough. But as I said, we do know that it takes about 5 years for the brain to rewire itself, and then things do tend to settle itself down. So what can we do about it? So there are some things that we definitely know. So we don't know that taking estrogen is definitely going to stop you from getting dementia, Alzheimer's. There is no research that definitively tells you that. There's no research that even says it reduces the risk. They think it might do, but the research is very inconclusive on that. But there are some things that we do know works, and this is research-based. We do know that diet, or the food that you eat, plays a really big role. We want to manage your insulin. We want to manage your inflammation, because now estrogen's not doing that. We need to do that because, as I just said, that when the brain actually is controlling insulin and it's controlling the inflammation, so we need to do things to actually reduce insulin resistance and reduce the inflammation. And that comes from looking at the foods that we're eating. So it's eating the foods that are beneficial for you. Now, there are foods that are known as phytoestrogen foods, which are foods that have got plant-based estrogen-like substances in them that do help to balance up that estrogen, and because there's different forms of estrogen, so it balances up the healthy versus the unhealthy. So things like flax seeds, sesame seeds, dried apricots, legumes, things like that. So if you're just eating a diet that's got lots of different plant foods in it, and nuts, seeds, soy in a natural form, not processed, you're going to be getting a lot of phytoestrogen foods, and they're also anti-inflammatory foods, and they're also foods that actually help to regulate your insulin. We need to also be looking at exercise. Exercise is really important, for several reasons. Number one, it raises your heart rate, and when it raises your heart rate, it increases blood flow up to the brain. So now we're getting more oxygen through the brain. And when we get more oxygen through the brain, basically it kind of livens it up. So we want as much oxygen going to the brain as possible. Exercise also reduces depression and anxiety. So there's a lot of research to show that exercise is as effective in reducing depression as taking antidepressants in mild forms of depression. So, exercise, there's so many benefits to exercise, as well as that, obviously it helps to manage weight, helps to manage your insulin as well. So there's a lot of things, a lot of benefits to exercise as well. Sleep is absolutely critical. We need sleep to recover our brain. When we go to sleep, our brain goes through a detoxification process, and we need to be in a deep sleep for this to happen. So if you're not getting a deep sleep, you're sleeping lightly or not sleeping at all, you're tossing and turning, then your brain is not able to kind of detoxify each night, which means then it becomes more foggy, and you're not able to think clearly because the brain is not getting rid of the stuff it doesn't need. So sleep is important. And I know for women coming through this time of life that quite often they struggle to sleep. Now, there's a couple of things that can stop you from getting a good night's sleep. Alcohol is one. So if you're finding you're waking up between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., whether that's with a hot flash, night sweats, or needing to go to the toilet, generally that's triggered by alcohol. Now, alcohol also impacts the brain because alcohol can cross the blood-brain barrier and it damages brain cells. And we don't want to damage brain cells. We don't want to be awake. So, alcohol is going to cause damage to your brain, and it's going to increase your risk of dementia, Alzheimer's, and issues with your brain. So it is really important that you get a good night's sleep. And there's lots of different things that you can do to be improving your sleep, getting rid of blue lights at night, technology at night, having a routine for calming down, things like having a bath or a shower, a warm bath or shower before bed. Lavender oil will help. There's some, beautiful teas, sleep teas. So there's lots of different things that you can be doing to improve your sleep. Don't eat too late at night either, because that can stop you from sleeping. Make sure that your room is at a comfortable temperature. You're not too hot, you're not too cold. So many things that we can be doing for really good sleep hygiene. And I've done a podcast on and sleep, and I'll put the link to that in the show notes. Also, reducing your exposure to toxins. Now, environmental toxins, some of them will cross the blood-brain barrier, which means it damages the brain. And there are some things that will actually do that, other things don't, but they cause inflammation. So, a lot of chemicals and toxins will inflame your body. Your liver's not clearing it properly. It stresses your body. So even if it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, it's still causing an impact on the brain because your body is inflamed, it's stressed, and that will impact the brain. So reducing toxins, and that's your environmental toxins that comes with your cleaning products, your personal care products, things that you're exposed to. Now, you can't get rid of all toxins. It would be great, but we can't live in a no-tox life. But there's a lot of things you can do to reduce toxicity, and look at some of the products that you're using and start to reduce them and replace them with less toxic products. Smoking as well is a toxin. It damages the brain. I'm hoping people aren't smoking, but if they are, there's nothing good about smoking, and it will increase your risk of Alzheimer's and dementia. Stress is also a big one. Now, I talk about stress all the time. Stress, all forms of stress, and a lot of this is to do with this communication that's happening between the brain and the adrenal glands. And when your body is producing a whole pile of cortisol, and you probably know when you're highly stressed, you can't really think properly. You can't think clearly because the brain is sending all these messages, and the adrenal glands is responding, and it's producing all this hormone cortisol, and the brain doesn't have the energy to be able to be focused. We know this. You know that you can't. If you've got a whole pile of stress coming at you, emotional stress, it's really hard to think clearly and make rational decisions because we tend to become very emotional and we make reactive decisions. So stress plays a really big role, and understanding where that stress is coming from, whether it's physical, so that's the food, the environment, the toxins. Is it mental? What's going on in your daily life? Is it emotional? Sometimes it is trauma that you're holding on to, which quite often can start to resurface as you come through the menopause transition. Now, it's really important that self-care is also something that you look at and practice on a regular basis. And this is, having a mindset that menopause, if you have a mindset that menopause is going to be the worst time of your life, it probably will be. So changing that mindset, changing those belief systems, doing things like meditation, journaling, maybe some yoga, lots of different things you can do to calm the mind down. Because if you've got this monkey mind that's going all of the time, there's a lot of stress that's going on. It also uses up a lot of energy. So the brain has an energy just like the rest of your body, and your brain will get tired if it's continually thinking about all of this stuff that's in your head. So we need to find ways to calm that down a little bit. And journaling is a great thing to do, to kind of just dump a whole pile of stuff out on a piece of paper. No one needs to read it, but you can just let all that go. And the other thing is actually use your mind, use your brain, and that's keeping it active, doing puzzles, being creative, whatever it is to maintain cognitive behavior. Now, I want to actually make a point too, because this is sometimes, we think women think they're going crazy. You're actually not going crazy, just letting you know that. But when it comes to cognition, women, as they come through this menopause transition and their brain rewires, and there has been tests done that women are just as cognitive as men. So the same level, there is no difference. We're not dumber than men. We're just as intelligent as men, even though all these changes are happening to our brains that aren't necessarily happening to men's brains. So we're not getting any dumber, but we might get a little bit distracted. We might be tired. Our brain is tired, which means we can't think clearer. We still have the cognition. We still have the intelligence. So you're not going crazy. It's just you can't get your thoughts out maybe quite as clearly as you used to before. The intelligence is still there, but just know that it does settle down as you get postmenopausal. So just as we finish up, about at the moment, research is still being done, but we do think about 2 to 3% of people who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's actually have a gene mutation, or they have a family predisposition to Alzheimer's disease. And because that's like only a really small number, we do know that it's not just genetics. Now, it is important that you understand that genetics can play a role, and if there's a history of Alzheimer's in your family, that there are things you can do. And this is what we call epigenetics. So you can influence how the genes actually express themselves. So should you have the genes, and you don't necessarily need to know that you have the specific gene, you will know from your family history. So if you know that, your mother, your father, your grandmother, or whatever within your lineage has had some type of dementia, Alzheimer's, or brain degeneration, that you are a higher risk of that, which means you probably hold the gene for it. But genes don't have to express themselves. You can change the expression of the genes, and expression just means it's being turned on. So you don't have to turn that gene on. You can actually turn it off. And the best ways to turn that off is the things I just said, the things that, by eating the right foods, by moving your body, by, using your brain, by reducing toxins, all those things that I spoke about, they will actually turn off the gene. It's what we call epigenetics. It's the science of epigenetics, or what happens above the genes or before the gene. So you can actually influence that by making better choices. And the research is back this up. This is a lot. There's a lot of research around this, that lifestyle and food factors play a really, really big role. So I'm just going to share with you a couple of really good resources if you want to read a little bit more about this. So there's a book, and I love this, and it's called The Upgrade, and by Dr. Luann Brizardine, and she calls the menopause transition an upgrade. It's a brain upgrade. The brain needs to upgrade itself. And so that was a really great book to read, and I've read that. The Menopause Brain, as I said, has recently been published by Dr. Lisa Mosconi, and it's based on her research, so some great information in there. And Dr. Sarah McKay, she's a neuroscientist. She's based here in Australia. She's doing a lot of work around this as well. She's written a couple of books, none specific on menopause, but if you can get to hear her talk, or if you just go and look at her website, there's probably blogs and everything over there. She's doing a lot of work about the changes that happen to women through the lifestyle. So, from puberty to pregnancy, and beyond into a menopause. So she's doing a lot of work on that as well. So highly recommend those resources if you are a little bit concerned that maybe you have a predisposition to this. So, and what you can do about it. But really what you can do about it is to make better choices around your food, around your lifestyle, and put yourself in control and not be afraid. If you continue to use your brain, however you want to do that, you stay healthy as you age, your risk of getting Alzheimer's, even if it's genetic, is vastly reduced. Those who are developing these diseases generally have poor diet, poor lifestyle choices, and they're just not using their brain. So, there are things that you can do to reduce your risk. So hopefully you've enjoyed this episode of the Menopause Conversations podcast. Please feel free to share it with other people who you think may be interested. If you know that another woman has got a family history of this and might be a little bit concerned, feel free to share the podcast with them. Now, if you enjoy the podcast and you've been listening to the podcast, please leave a rating or review. Apple Podcasts is the biggest platform, so if you can leave one on Apple Podcasts, but that will only work if you've got an iPhone. They're kind of very protective. So if you've got an iPhone and you can get into Apple Podcasts, please leave a review. If not, wherever you're listening listening to this podcast, if you're listening over on my website, leave a comment under the blog where it's all loaded. But share it with others so that more women can learn about this. And if you want to continue this conversation, why not pop over to the Menopause Conversations Facebook group, where I talk about a lot more things over there, and we'll have a lot of discussions going on. So go over there and join. If you're not already a member, come over and join us and join in the conversation, and we'll start a bit more of a conversation around Alzheimer's disease. So thank you for joining me today, and I'll be back next week with another episode of the Menopause Conversations podcast. Bye for now.